Hi, I'm Terry Dunne. I'm Clare Library's historian in residence for 2024. And for History Week with 2024, we're looking at landscapes and how the landscape changed from the early 19th century to the early 20th century. But while landscape, we often think of the countryside, landscape is also the urban environment. And today we're going to be listening to Peter Connell talk about public housing in Kilrush. And we already had Lucille Ellis earlier on in the week talking about the housing of the urban professional class in Ennis. Now we're going to hear something of the housing of the working class in Kilrush. Peter um, will be talking about this is part of Peter's PhD research, which he did a couple of years ago in Trinity on urban public housing in the early 20th century in Ireland. He looked at 15 different towns or had case studies based on 15 different towns, and one of them was Kilrush. And he'll be bringing out a book based on this research, which I know I'm looking forward to. I'm not going to talk for any longer. I'm just going to put you straight over to Peter. And thanks very much for coming and contributing, Peter.
Thanks, Terry, and thanks for the invitation to give this talk. Firstly, I want to get my apologies in at the start. I'm definitely a blow-in where County Clare and Kilrush is concerned. What I know about the history of the town is based on research in the National Archives, in the County Clare Archives in Ennis, and from various primary sources now available on the internet. I'm no more than an occasional visitor to Kilrush, unfortunately, so you'll have to excuse any howlers I come up with over the next 40 minutes or so. And secondly, why my interest in Kilrush? Well, I'm sorry to say it's not because Kilrush is particularly exceptional when it comes to clearing its poor housing or building council housing. The reason is to do with sources. In 1996, the state handed over the archives of the Department of Local Government to the National Archives. These are the records of the work of county councils and urban councils stretching back to 1922 and the foundation of the state. It's a fabulously rich collection covering topics such as roads, water schemes, housing, planning, local elections, cemeteries, the real life of local communities. This collection remained inaccessible to the public until 2013 when cataloguing started. This was done on an alphabetical basis, starting with Carlow, then Clare, Cork, and Donegal. Then cataloguing stopped, and the staff in the National Archives were told to focus on the decade of centenaries. So the County Clare records have been catalogued and are accessible, and the Kilrush records relating to housing in the 1930s are especially interesting. So that's my little kind of complaint in at the start, that these really, really interesting records are only available for certain counties, but fortunately they are available for Clare. So I want to start by saying a few words about the title of the talk. The government wants a terrible lot of light, clearing the slums in 1930s Kilrush. The title contains two quotes. The first, the government wants a terrible lot of light, is from a woman in Hector Street in 1939, whose house had been condemned and was marked for demolition. Dr. Daly, the medical officer for health, had described her kitchen before a public inquiry as very badly lit and ventilated. The woman was naturally upset. We don't often hear the perspective of the people whose homes were condemned as part of the major rehousing programme of the 1930s, that in Kilrush resulted in the building of new houses in Pella Road, St Patrick's Terrace and Pound Street, and in other places. So I'm hoping to highlight that perspective of people living in these poorer areas of towns, who a perspective that we don't often hear. The second quote in the title of the talk uses the word slum. It's not my word, hence the quotes around it. This is the term, with all its negative connotations, that's used in official documents to describe places with poor housing like Hector Street and hundreds of other places and towns across the country. It reflects a different perspective, that of government officials, engineers, and doctors looking in from the outside, their view often coloured by social class. It's the term used in the Clare Champion of the time, for example. So I'm hoping to explore that perspective of the experts and professionals who use the word slum and in some cases had such power over the people who were generally poor and living in poor conditions. Let me start with some photographs. So these are different towns around the country, photographs of these quote unquote slum areas in the early 20th century. The top left there is Tralee. Below that is Hector Street in Kilrush. Below that again is Ennis. The three photographs in the middle then on the left is the man in the doorway is in Arklow. To the right of that is a laneway in Killarney. And on the bottom is a woman and her children in Cashel, County Tipperary. Over on the right-hand side then we have what I think is Drogheda, although it's not absolutely certain. Below it is Pensioners Row in Tullamore, and then a group of children in Drogheda, again around 1910. So you don't often see these photographs. A lot of us would be familiar with the Lawrence collection, for example, where they photograph main streets and scenic views, churches, convents, that sort of thing. So I've done a lot of searching to try and source photographs like this. And if anyone is out there who have photographs like this in a drawer somewhere, I'd be delighted if you contacted Terry, and I'm sure Terry could maybe put me in contact. It's something I'm interested in collecting. Again, we've lots of photographs of the tenement buildings in Dublin and other places, but provincial towns, not so much. No one, professional photographers weren't generally interested in photographing places like this. So these are places that are sometimes laneways near the centre of towns, like the one in Killarney there, the woman in the Cape, or long straggling streets like the one there in Ennis in the bottom left corner, or on the top there in Tralee. Thatched cabins, really, which survived in Irish towns into the 1930s. Now, a way of getting a handle on housing conditions is to look at overcrowding, because there's a lot of evidence that levels of overcrowding correlate with poor housing. Overcrowding correlates with lack of sanitation, uh, leaky roofs, small windows, floors below the level of the street, all that sort of thing. If you go through hundreds and hundreds of these cases, overcrowding is a good measure of poor housing. And here we have Kilrush showing up in 1926 among the top 10, or the bottom 10, if you like, in that 30% of the population lived in overcrowded conditions, which was defined at the time of more than two people per room. So that's five people in a two-roomed house or seven people in a three-roomed house. Now, incredibly, when you think of it, 20% of the population of Kilrush in 1926 were living more than three per room. So that's seven in a two-roomed house, or 10 in a three-roomed house. And when I say two rooms, I'm talking about very small rooms and very small houses. So these levels of overcrowding and poor housing in Irish provincial towns compare very unfavourably with Britain, for example, with England. Lancashire, an industrial county in England, typical rates of overcrowding would be about 5 to 7%. Comparable rates of overcrowding can be found only in the northeast mining towns in Durham and Northumberland, and they were also notorious in the mining villages of Western Scotland, where it was up to 40%, 45%. But comparatively, towns like Kilrush, Drogheda, Newbridge, Edenderry that you see there, where housing conditions were really very poor. So there's a way again of getting a handle on this by looking at the 1901 and 1911 census. So I'm going to just look at a few areas in Kilrush where we can identify the worst housing. Uh, Two of them here are Grey Street um, and Malthouse Lane off Moore Street. And I've a little snippet there. That table for Malthouse Lane, for example, you have the names of the head of household, and to the left, to the right of that, then you have the number of rooms in the house and then the number of occupants. So you'll see halfway down the list, there's a two-roomed house with nine occupants. Farther down, you have another one with two rooms and seven occupants. So anyone can go along to the 1901 and 1911 census. I'm sure you're all familiar with them online on the National Archives website. And each street has associated with it a form showing housing conditions, and that's where I've got this data. Similar picture here in the Glen, over in the northeast of the town. Here we have on the eastern side of the Glen a series of one-roomed cabins, really you'd call them, and again, five living in one. We have eight. I think we have another one there with seven or eight living in a two-roomed house. And then Pound Street, Hector Street, and Crofton Street, which we'll be looking at later on, over in the west of the town. Again, a similar pattern: one and two-roomed houses, small thatched houses, anything from five, six, up to nine living in one house. There's one there, Patrick McKnight, three-roomed house in Hector Street, nine inhabitants. Another one above that, a two-roomed house with eight inhabitants. So this is where we get our 30% of the population living in overcrowded conditions. And it's very easy to identify these in towns all around the country by just going into the 1901 or 1911 census and looking at the profiles of different streets. Of course, when you come to the main streets, the profile is completely different. You've got three-story, two and three-story houses, six, seven, eight-roomed houses, sometimes with only one family living in it with four or five people. So generally, these quote unquote slum areas are easily identified by looking at this, looking at the census. These three areas that we've just looked at on the map, were the quote unquote slum areas in Kilrush. Now, in fact, this area that you see here in the on the west of the town, Pound Street, Hector Street, Crofton Street, 65% of the population here were living more than two per room, overcrowded conditions, which is an incredibly high figure. So we can only speculate to some extent what this area looks like, apart from that photograph of Hector Street that we happen to have. Now, 1932 is my key year because that's when what we call the slum clearance started. But prior to that, councils across the country and in Kilrush had been active in building public housing. There was a small amount prior to the formation of the new state in 1922, not in Kilrush though. And then in Kilrush, there were a few houses built in the early 20s, and then these ones here, Nangle Terrace, Pella Road and Fahey's Road, were built in the late 20s. Now, some of this had to do with the fact that Fianna Fáil entered the Dáil in 1927 and started campaigning on a number of issues, including housing. And they started putting pressure on the Cumann Gael government. And a key thing that happened was the local loans fund, which up to that point had only been available to provide loans to local authorities for roads, was opened up for housing. There were a lot of constraints on it though, because the loans were at fairly high interest rates. and the repayment schedules were fairly tight. So when the houses were built, in order to be economical from the council's point of view, the rents were quite high. There were maybe 7, 8, 9 shillings a week, where the people living in the very poorest areas, like we've just been looking at, could afford no more than 4 shillings a week. So the people who moved into these areas would have been people in regular employment. They might have been blue collar workers, manual workers, but they would have been in regular employment. Some of them would have been semi-skilled. Some of them would have been post office workers, people working in hospitals, that kind of thing. So they would have made a contribution to the housing stock in Kilrush, but they wouldn't have addressed the what we'll call slum question, because the people living there simply couldn't have afforded the rents here. So the 1932 general election campaign was fought on a whole range of different issues, but looking at this Fianna Fáil poster from the election, you'll see that building was a huge issue. Some of it to do with providing new housing and new roads and all that, but a huge part of it to do with creating employment. Early 1930s, there was chronic and widespread unemployment. Of course, we'd had the Wall Street crash, a recession, and the housing can be seen as part of an economic stimulus, which also involved building hospitals, promoting local industry. You'll be familiar with Fianna Fáil's uh, economic program in the 30s. So one of the first bills that was brought in was the 1932 Housing Act in the summer of 1932. Now, in fact, the last piece of legislation passed in the preceding Dáil in December 1931 was the 1931 Housing Act, brought in by Cumann Gale. But there were some really significant differences between the two acts, and some things were the same. One of the key differences was to do with the level of subsidy available for local councils. So you'll see there that the 1931 Act was going to give a 30% subsidy to local councils in repaying their loans for housing, whereas the 1932 Act was going to give a two-thirds subsidy, 66.6%, on the repayment of loans. And this is where houses had been condemned and the residents were offered a new council house. So what this meant was that rents could be kept reasonably low. 2 and 6, 3 shillings, maybe 4 shillings a week. So this was the key difference. A high government subsidy allowed councils to keep the rents low on these houses. Now, this was a radical piece of legislation. Interestingly enough, it exactly mirrored the Greenwood Act passed in England a few years earlier. And so you could say that despite our political independence, our solution to poor housing more or less copied the British legislation. And a Department of Finance official in Dublin is quoted as saying, the British, who are wise guys, probably thought the whole thing through carefully. So, in other words, rather than put the work in to an Irish solution for an Irish problem, they just took the Greenwood Act from Britain and applied it in Ireland, more or less. The declaration of a clearance area meant defining an area like, for example, the Glen as an unhealthy area. This was done by the local engineers and doctors. So if the houses were of no sanitation, the houses were too small, in poor condition, a group of these houses was called a clearance area. And the houses in these clearance areas had to be demolished. The owners of the houses got no compensation unless their livelihoods were directly affected. So, for example, if you had a house and an adjoining forge, uh, that would destroy the livelihood of the family in that case, so they would get compensation. But generally, there was no compensation, and the site had to be cleared at the owner's expense. Sites could be CPO'd by the council, but on a site-only basis. So the compensation paid there was nothing for the condemned houses, but only for the plot of land. Now, this was a very radical assault, if you like, on private property. Landlords who had been deriving a rental income from these condemned properties, that was going to be wiped out, and they were going to have to pay for the demolition of the houses. So it was a quite a radical move, and elicited quite a bit of opposition from landlords, various kinds of landlords, but sometimes from the residents themselves, as we're going to see. So in the course of the 1930s, there were three clearance areas defined in Kilrush. The first one in 1934 in Grey Street. They started small. They just took one small street, declared it a clearance area, and built houses to accommodate the people in Grey Street. The second one then was a dispersed one, really. It was the Glen up in the northeast of the town, uh, Malthouse Lane that we saw earlier off Moore Street, and over in the west of the town, the northern side of Pound Street. And then in 1939, finally, the southern side of Pound Street, Crofton Street, and Hector Street. So each of those had a whole lot of documentation, public inquiries, a whole business linked to them. So this is what happened then in terms of the clearance orders and the housing schemes. So you see the clearance orders there on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side, the new estates that were built to accommodate the people being moved out of the unhealthy areas as they were defined. So this was a really significant remaking of the town, the demolition of dozens and dozens of houses, and the building of dozens and dozens of new houses. So something I'm not going to be talking about today is the whole business of the tendering and the building of these houses. So this is taken from the minute books of Kilrush Urban Council, the building of the houses on the north side of Pound Street. You can see there the builders, the building contractors who won the tender. It was divided up over four builders, and the houses mostly cost about £300 each. The government actually put a ceiling of initially put a ceiling of £300 on each house. That's all. If you spent more than 300, you didn't get subsidies for that. But they were a little bit flexible as the 1930s went on and building costs rose. But you're looking at a very standard four-roomed concrete house with asbestos slates. The houses were about 600 square feet, and we look at how that compares to the small houses that people were moving from. So, related to these clearance areas, there were a whole lot of interested parties. There were landlords, tenants, homeowners, local politicians, ratepayers, etc. So I just want to say a few words about each of those. Now, in Kilrush, one of the interested parties were obviously the Vandalaires, the big landlords in the town. And I'm going to quote from a letter here from the agent for the Vandalaire estate, who was most unhappy with the local council. So the letter is dated the 9th of May 1940, and it relates to the final clearance area 3, down in Hector Street and the southern side of Pound Street. So he's talking about his own tenants who are being evicted effectively. Their case is that they always paid their rents to the Vandalaire estate and are willing to continue to do so if left in their little homes. In view of this, which is generally true, I do not see how the Kilrush Urban Council can reasonably expect the Vandeleur estate to evict them now. To do so would, in my opinion, be placing the estate in an invidious position, at least as regards these poor tenants, and I am not prepared to do that merely to facilitate the council. It ought to be possible to find some modus operandi than eviction. As some, if not all, of the tenants of the houses in question are either poor widows or husband and wife without dependents, and all old, would it not be possible for the council to arrange that these poor tenants are left in their little homes during their lives, which in many of the cases will not be many years? After all, humble as these little homes are, the people who reside in them have an attachment for them which is not perhaps readily understandable by a public body like Kilrush Urban Council. Again, these poor tenants state if they go into the council's new houses, they will not be able to pay the council's higher rents. The result will be, of course, they will be ejected and then they will have no place to go save the county home. They further state that the council's anxiety to demolish their little homes is to secure the grants of £60 per house, to demolish the houses with little regard for their feelings in this matter. So obviously the Vandeleurs had a bit of a vested interest there. They were collecting rents from these tenants, but also they were in the front. They would appear to be in the front line of the evictions. Now, it was actually the council who were going to evict the people where the houses were condemned, but as the landlords, they would appear to be in the front line and maybe having to share some of the blame. The next interested parties were the tenants. Some mostly paying very low rents, maybe a shilling, 1 and 6pence a week, 2 shillings a week to the Vandeleurs, or maybe to other smaller landlords. So invariably, they were probably going to move into a council house that was going to cost them 4 shillings a week, 3 and 6, 4 shillings a week. So they were naturally concerned, and we'll come back to that in a minute because we'll be hearing from some of the tenants as part of the public inquiries. Then we had local politicians. Fianna Fáil councillors had to be seen to support government policy. Labour Party councillors traditionally had campaigned for council housing and were generally pushing for more building to address a chronic unemployment in the town. Cumann na nGaedheal / Fine Gael councillors, who would have been under the ratepayer banner, they would be fearful that the level of rates would go out of control. So in other words, if the cost of building the houses proved to be uneconomic, or if rents weren't paid, it would be the ratepayer who would have to foot the bill. So they'd be in, generally the ratepayers' parties and councillors would be keen to keep rates as low as possible. Now, in fact, on some occasions, they attempted to slow down the drive towards the demolition of houses and the council taking on new housing loans. Now, as it turned out, the ratepayers in Kilrush didn't subsidise the council housing. Between the government subsidies and the rents, they were able to cover the cost of the houses in the years through the 1930s, which wasn't the case in a lot of other towns. We then had the Urban Council and its professionals, doctors, engineers, solicitors. They all had a key role in defining these unhealthy areas, in interacting with the residents who were going to be moved. So we'll have a look at those in a minute as well. And finally, then, the Department of Local Government. And it's interesting here, maybe in the context of our current housing crisis, that the minister drove this quote unquote slum clearance programme. Sean T. O'Kelly was minister right through this period, and one civil servant described him as quote, carrying a fiery cross through the country, relating to this housing campaign. So some urban councils were threatened with abolition unless they were seen to be furthering the housing program. Um, and in fact, one or two were dissolved in the 30s. So it's interesting. This is kind of a side view, but I've looked at the provision of housing across all 74 provincial towns, and there's huge variations. Kilrush would be kind of in the middle in terms of their provision. Towns like Drogheda, Tullamore, Navan were very proactive. Other towns like Ennis were right down at the bottom of the league. So this can tell us all sorts of things about social relations, class relations, governance, all sorts of things about local government at the time, the ones who were proactive as against the ones who weren't. And as I say, there were great disparities across towns. So when it comes then to, yeah, these are photographs then of the new estates that were built in the 30s. Again, I don't have any photographs that are contemporary. These are obviously modern photographs. And there's Crawford Street, St. Joseph's Terrace, and St. Patrick's Terrace, built in 1939 on the site of the old Union Workhouse. And finally, Pound Street, which was built linked to Clearance Area 3 that we're going to look at in a few minutes. So this kind of documentation then is available in the National Archives relating to each of those clearance areas. This is the first one, Grey Street, over in the east of the town. You'll see the map there, and then over in the bottom right corner there, it gives the size of each house in as part of the documentation. And you'll see that there were 9 houses of less than 300 square feet, which is really a tiny house. You know, they would have been mostly 2 rooms. So 300 square feet is really, really very small. And you'll see that there were 7 and 8 people living in some of those houses. There's a letter there from one of the residents in Grace. This is actually Crawford Street, who had an objection, was writing to the council. I won't quote the whole letter, but in the end, this woman, who was a widow, said the council can have the honour of evicting a widow if they are able. So there were a lot of very strident communications into the council, people kind of defending their place in their homes and feeling very bitter about the fact that they were going to be moved on. After the local elections in 1934, Fianna Fáil and a combination of Fianna Fáil and Labour were in control of Kilrush Urban Council, and there was a motion here put down by Mr. Lillis that we adjourn consideration of the Pound Street clearance. So in other words, an attempt to kind of hold the thing up. Let's not rush our fences here. We've just finished the Grey Street one. Let's not do another one. But the combination of Fianna Fáil, PJ Hughes there moved an amendment. I think he was a Fianna Fáil councillor. He said, no, let's go ahead with this. So there were always tensions on the council as to the pace at which these developments took place. In 1934, there was a petition sent to the council from the residents in Hector Street who felt that these are good houses built of stone and gardens attached, and if they were being moved, they'd want to have their new houses free of rent and other charges, which was a pretty hopeless wish, really, because they were always going to be charged rent in the new houses. So this then was part of the second clearance area, the Glen, over in the east of the town. Attached to the declaration of a clearance area, you had all this kind of information, how many were living in each house, the occupation of the head of household, the income of the household, and the size of the house in square feet. So this is really useful information. You'll see there a lot of labourers are put down at 12 shillings a week, 12 and sixpence a week. This would indicate that they're in casual employment. Other labourers there are on 25 shillings a week and more. So a labourer working with the council or even with a local shop, a yard man in a shop could expect to be earning 25, 30 shillings a week. So you'll see there was an awful lot of casual employment and seasonal work, that sort of thing. So real poverty in places like the Glen with very low incomes. Home assistance at the time was 10 shillings a week. So the old age pension was 10 shillings a week as well. So this was a rent then of 4 shillings a week in the new houses was going to be quite a burden. Again, you see a number of tiny houses there and not much more than 200 square feet, which is basically a small room. Now, when the houses, it was set down that once the residents had moved away and gone into their new council houses, the houses had to be demolished at the expense of the landlord. And the photograph on the top there is actually from Carrick-on-Suir in County Tipperary. But the one on the bottom there is actually in the Glen. And I suspect, which I took that photograph last year, and I suspect it's been like that since the 1930s. The roofs were taken off the houses. If the council didn't buy the plot of land, a lot of them just sat there for years and years. And I suspect through the 40s and 50s and 60s, there were a lot of these vacant spaces near the centre of towns where, quote unquote, slums had been cleared, but nothing had been done with them afterwards. Some of them have turned into car parks. It's a very common thing. Car parks near town centres all around Ireland were actually the site of former slums from 80 and 90 and 100 years ago. These are the Malthouse Lane clearance orders. Again, the same type of information. The landlord here objected to the clearance. And there's a typed letter from him there, so more or less saying, oh, the houses aren't so bad. If I can just quote a small piece from that letter. The inspector, after he says the houses, could be fixed up, the inspector asked the landlord, are they habitable at the moment? Well, they may have a leak down or a thing like that. The inspector says then, are they in good condition at the moment? No, at the moment, but a small repair would put them right. I did not want to lose any money on them in view of this scheme going on for the past 3 years. So landlords were unwilling to invest anything in these houses because they knew they were likely to be demolished once the council turned their spotlight onto places like Malthouse Lane. Now, in fact, the houses in Malthouse Lane were in an atrocious condition, broken windows, no backyards, so night soil was taken in a bucket each night and emptied out in the street. So they're really, really terrible conditions, despite the claims of the landlord. Now, this is what Pound Street North might have looked like in the mid 1930s. This is actually a street in Ennis, but that would be very, very typical of what these streets on the edges of provincial towns look like in the mid 1930s. And that's the engineer's report on the houses. Again, the clearance orders have all full descriptions of the houses, how many rooms, the levels of light, condition of whether it was damp, size of the windows, the whole thing. They went into tremendous detail on the condition of each house. So I'm going to focus now on the third clearance area, which is here on the south side of Pound Street, Crofton Street and Hector Street. And this was declared in 1939. There was a public inquiry if there were the houses in red there were marked for demolition, And if anyone objected, be it a landlord or a tenant or somebody who actually owned their house in the area, there had to be a public inquiry. An inspector came down from Dublin and all sides got to have their say. The public inquiry to confirm this particular clearance order took place in June 1939 when Mr. Ryan, an engineer, came down as an inspector from the Department of Local Government, and the inquiry took place in Kilrush Town Hall. The clearance order proposed the demolition of 57 dwellings, as shown here on the map, and there were 30 objections lodged relating to the inclusion of properties in the order. It's worth noting that there were no objections in the case of 27 dwellings. A few were in ruins. Some may have been unaware of the inquiry, but we can speculate that some were quite satisfied to move to a new council house. For example, there were 61 applicants for the 32 new houses in Crawford Street in 1937, so there was a big demand for the new houses. Here are some of the residents making statements to the inquiry regarding their houses being condemned. One man, a mill hand who lived with his wife in number 43, was questioned by a solicitor and asked to comment on the fact that the doctor had stated his house was not fit to live in. The man replied, "I can say that the house is fit for the doctor or the priest himself to live in." The two-room thatched house was faulted by the medical officer for health. Quote, lighting and ventilation in the kitchen is very bad, bad roof, dampness, low floor levels. When viewed by the inspector, he concluded house in very bad condition. The resident in number 7, the woman of the house, was asked to comment on the fact that the medical officer of health had identified a serious lack of light in her house. She replied, "I was very much surprised to hear that the house had not sufficient ventilation or light, because I think our kitchen is splendid. Of course, the government wants a terrible lot of light, and we could put in a bigger window. I was very surprised at Dr. Daly, as I had a higher opinion of him." So she sounds like a formidable woman, and I wouldn't be sure Dr. Daly would come out on the right side of an argument. Now, in fact, she convinced the inspector that the house shouldn't be demolished, and it wasn't. Another man who represented himself at the inquiry succeeded in overturning the council's inclusion of his house in the order. He said, "It is roofed and slated, and when examined, it had everything suitable in it. As for air, I have too bloody much of it." The official's high regard for ventilation had an impact on a number of witnesses. The resident in number 32, when asked if her house had adequate air and light, replied, "Yes, we have too much of it. It is like a sanatorium." So it's absolutely great to hear the voices of the people in these houses, you know, giving a good response to the professionals who were drawing up all these measurements and all these files relating to the houses they lived in. These are important sources because they give agency to the people living in these condemned areas. They're not just pawns to be moved around at the behest of engineers and medics. There's an interesting conversation between two of the doctors, where uh, uh, one says, "But for the class of people occupying these houses who would be prepared to accept the standard of living, would you consider the houses were sufficient for such people?" And the medical officer replied, "I'm afraid they cannot set the standard of living at all. It is we who have to set them." So the professionals had a strong sense of their own duty, that if they said the houses were inadequate, well, then it didn't really matter what the residents said. From the mid-19th century in England, the term slum had connotations beyond poor housing. It had implications of deviant behaviour, a lack of respectability, even a threat to the social order. So-called slum clearances in England in the 19th century was more about removing the threat to public health to wider society than the threat to the people who lived in these places. Things had certainly moved on by the 1930s, but some prejudices lingered. The district court judge at the opening of a new housing scheme in Letterkenny in 1937, for example, remarked that, quote, bad housing did more to breed crime than anything else. To provide people with good houses would considerably lessen the work of the judges, end quote. Fianna Fáil's housing programme was an economic stimulus designed to create employment. It was about state building, sweeping away poor housing, which it portrayed as a legacy of foreign rule and landlordism, and of course, providing over 12,500 new houses in provincial towns across the country helped build political support. So between 1934 and 1939, 12,500 new council houses were built in provincial towns. That's Hector Street in the early 20th century and Hector Street now. And interestingly enough, I think that little house on the left-hand side would be maybe typical of a lot of the houses that were in the street back in the 1930s. I'll skip that one there. And this gives you in a sense of the very positive effect of the public housing programme across a number of towns. Some of the towns that had the worst overcrowding, you'll see the huge drop by 1936 of the numbers living in overcrowded conditions. And you'll see the huge number of houses built, council houses built in some of these towns. So Arklow, Ballina, Tullamore, Navan, Drogheda in particular. And by 1946, half the population of Ballina, for example, were living in council houses. And in a lot of towns, it would be in the range of a third. So it was, at that level, it was a great achievement. Between 1934 and 1939, 196 houses were built by Kilrush Urban Council, representing a quarter of the town's housing stock. At the same time, 180 houses were demolished, again a quarter of the town's housing stock. In a short period of 6 years, this, I think, was one of the most significant changes in the landscape of the town in its long history. The 3 and 4 roomed concrete houses in Pella Road and St Patrick's Park were over twice the size of many of the small, damp houses in Hector Street and Pound Street, where families had moved from. They had running water and toilets, instead of collecting water in buckets at public pumps and emptying night soil into a cart that travelled the streets every night. Some certainly struggled to pay the rent, and the houses could be difficult to heat. For older people, the move must have been traumatic. For young families, though, the new houses offered new hope for the future.
Yeah, I mean, there's an awful lot to talk to talk further about that wonderful presentation, Peter. Thanks for it. There one thing kind of came to my mind. I was wondering if you could speak more to what kind of jobs would people who were living in these so-called slums be employed in? Well, you were saying there was a lot of casual work and a lot of seasonal work.
Yeah, if you look at the census from the early 20th century, 1901, 1911, you find that in most towns, about a quarter of the workforce were defined as labourers, unskilled labourers. And that mapped onto, to a large extent, onto the people living in the poorest housing. They couldn't afford anything else. So in Kilrush, you would have decent enough employment in Glenn's mills, the mills there, and there were mill workers obviously living in Hector Street, Pella Road, and around there, close to the mill. Other work would be like carters, unskilled labour around the town, maybe some working with the council. Um, but then you had a large body of men, and we're talking about men here, who were sometimes dependent on agricultural work. So if you go back into the late 19th century, you find that there was kind of migration into the towns, men looking for work, maybe moved out of rural areas as their cottages fell down. My research has kind of dealt with this, and you ended up with a kind of a cohort of people who were dependent on casual labour, day labour. They'd get work during the harvest. They'd get work potato picking. They'd get work in the haymaking season, they'd get work in the spring, that kind of thing. And they'd travel out the country for work. And they would represent, and they'd pick up bits of work around the town, whatever was going. Also, coming up to Christmas every year, the council would organise what they called relief schemes. The department would pass on maybe £300 or £400 to the council, and they'd take on 40 or 50 men to clear a river or clear the drains in the streets, that kind of thing. So what was really missing was industrial employment, regular industrial employment that would uh, provide a livelihood for, half the population, half the families in a town, like you'd get in England, for example. So Irish towns had been deindustrialized, really, and you had this large cohort of people, the unskilled labourers, some of whom depending on casual work.
Mhm. But some of the emphasis in the 1930s, as comes out in your talk, as regards the housing schemes, were as economic stimulus and to at least promoted with the idea they were providing employment. And of course, as part of that, there was also an attempt to set up new industries. And I know with interest that the houses, and I think it was Pound Street in 1939, in one of your slides, were being constructed with the very modern, it must have seemed at the time, building materials of mass concrete and Serstat asbestos slates. I didn't know there was a Serstat asbestos slates. Um, so yeah, did that cause problems going forward? Because I suppose we don't see them as the optimum building materials now. And
No, well, there were a couple of problems with it. One, with mass concrete. One was that builders weren't that familiar with it. So often you had things like cracks in walls, and maybe some of them had outside toilets, and they became kind of as a kind of an adjunct at the back of the house, and it became separated from the house because they hadn't been built properly with the concrete or the roofs cracking. So that was one issue, the fact it was new. I did come across a case in one town where they poured a concrete floor in the houses, and then they put wooden floors on top of it without letting the concrete dry sufficiently, with the result that the floorboards all rotted within a couple of months. So there was that problem. The other issue was heating. The mass concrete houses were subject to damp, condensation, mold, all that sort of thing. So it now the houses were supplied with ranges, and there wouldn't have been no shortage of turf to burn in most cases. So that's how they kept the houses reasonably dry. The key consideration, though, I think, would have been cost. So the department in Dublin kept a very tight rein on costs. And when the tenders came in from builders, the department nearly always insisted on the lowest tender, and the lowest tender was invariably mass concrete. Above that would be concrete blocks, and above that again would be brick. Now, unless there were particular local circumstances, like in Drogheda, where most of the houses built at this time were brick, or Athy, which had its own brickworks, uh, they were built of mass concrete. And also, in terms of design, architects were not employed. So what you had were off-the-shelf plans provided by the department. So you had a G4 type house, or you had a G1 type house, or a G7 type house. And as you drive around the country, at this stage, I can kind of say, oh, well, that was built in about 35 and it's a G4. And you see exactly the same house, maybe 200 miles away on the other side of the country because they built a G4 as well. So there are a limited number of designs. It's a bit different. Pre-World War One, for example, architects were often employed to design the houses, and there's a great variety of houses, and sometimes the council houses are difficult to distinguish from maybe houses built by a railway company or by a landlord or something like that. But post 1932, they're all of a limited range of types.
But pre 1914, we'd be talking mostly about the rural council cottages.
Mostly,
Yeah.
but I think about 3,500 houses were built in provincial towns. Now that's excluding Dublin, Cork, Limerick, Waterford. So nearly every town built some. Like my own hometown of Navan, they built 100 council houses before 1914. So it did happen.
Um, and the other thing I was wondering about the opposition from residents of the so-called slums that were due to be cleared. Well, I guess in some cases, I mean, there was no there was no need to knock their houses, as you pointed out in a couple of instances where the houses weren't knocked.
Yeah,
And I suppose in other cases, people just had a kind of jaundiced view of what would be done to them by the
absolutely.
powers
Yeah,
that
yeah,
be, justifiably jaundiced one. And in others, I suppose there was the matter of higher rents as well. But could you speak to the opposition? Because on the other hand, I mean, this was a policy that had popular support. Like, so yeah, just maybe tell us a little bit
yeah,
about the opposition and people's grounds for opposing the clearances and the new developments.
yeah. I think at one level I may have slightly overemphasized the opposition from the residents themselves, but I think it's important that we kind of hear those voices because they were part of the whole process. Um, there were different categories of opposition. So, one group I think it's worth mentioning, particularly in relation to Kilrush, would have been people who bought their houses from the Vandaliers maybe around the 1920s. So, as landlords were divested themselves of land, they were also divested themselves of houses in towns. So, people in uh, Pella Road or wherever might have paid the Vandaliers £50, a knockdown price for a house maybe that the family had occupied for the previous 30 years. So the Vandaliers did sell off houses reasonably cheaply. So, a relatively poor family would invest £50 in a house, say in 1925, invested maybe another 20 or £30 to fix the roof, maybe concrete the floor inside, a few things like that. And then the council came along 10 years later and said, sorry, this house isn't up for standard. We're knocking it down and you're not getting any compensation. So that was a real blow to that family, knowing they were moving into a council house where they would have to pay rent. And you'll have seen there in the petition from the residents in Hector Street that they were demanding that they'd get a house that they wouldn't have to pay a rent when they moved into it, which of course was never going to happen. So they're one category. Then you had by the 1930s, I think the level of overcrowding in those areas wasn't what it had been 30 years earlier. Um, that we saw in the 1901 and 1911 census. Families, emigration from towns like Kilrush was quite high, and it was poorer families, of course, who were emigrating the most. So there had been depopulation, I would say, a bit of those streets. So what you were left with maybe was an older couple on the old age pension who didn't, they felt perfectly happy in their two rooms, no matter what the local engineer said. And they didn't want to move into a four-roomed council house where they'd have to pay 4 shillings a week. So there was that category that I think the Vandalair agent mentioned older people. So that's another group. Another interesting group were what you might call petty landlords, and there was one in the Glen, I think it was, a man who owned 8 houses in the Glen, who was collecting about £1 a week in rents. And he says, if I lose my income with no compensation, I just have to go into the county home. Um, so there were that category, but of course he was on a loser because there was very little sympathy, political or otherwise, for the landlord class in Ireland in the 1930s. So whether you were a big landlord or a small landlord, he wasn't going to get much of a hearing. An interesting thing of what he said as well was he used to get £1 from a week rent from his different houses, but now he was only getting 12 shillings because a lot of his tenants had moved out into council houses, and the council houses had actually brought down private rents in the town. They were creating decent council houses, were creating good competition for inferior private rental accommodation. And I think, even if I can make a political statement, uh, if we built lots of social housing now, it's going to actually address the private rental sector because you're building decent houses at decent rents so that the bad landlords won't have demand anymore. People won't want to live in those places anymore. So I think what happened in the 1930s gives us a bit of a lesson for what can happen now and what maybe should happen now if investment is made in adequate social housing.
I think we'll wrap up with that point, Peter. And thanks very much for your contribution. And I think we all, myself certainly, look forward to seeing it in print and to be able to find out um, more about this important social reform.
Great,
Thanks.
Terry. Good to talk to you.